My family and I recently got back from an extended trip in Japan where we did a lot of sightseeing in places like Nara and Kyoto, seeing ancient temples and things like the Daibutsu giant Buddha statue you can see here. We had a great time overall, although it was incredibly hot and humid, and we did end up, all of us, getting sick at one time or another. Whenever I go to Japan, I always try and see what kind of Star Wars merchandise I can find that's unique to Japan, especially things that are related to Jabba, of course, but just generally speaking, I like to see Star Wars merchandise that you can't get anywhere else. So in this first video, I thought it might be interesting to show some of the places that I went in search of Star Wars merchandise and other toys as well. And then in the next one, I'll show off some of the items that I actually purchased. This is kind of unrelated, but it was interesting enough that I kind of wanted to talk about it. This is Toji Temple in Kyoto, and they have a monthly kind of flea market called Garakutaichi, where they sell things like antiques and old toys, art, things like that. Basically, you never know what you're going to find there. I didn't actually expect to find anything in the way of Star Wars, and I didn't, but I did get a couple of very interesting items. Stick around to the end of the video if you're interested in seeing those. But yeah, it was just right there in the grounds of the temple itself. You could go around and see dozens and dozens of people selling their wares. Pretty cool. I also stopped by a Toys R Us just to see what they had, and yes, they do still exist in Japan. They had a decent selection, I would say, better than some stores in the US, although prices were high and they seem to be focusing on just adult collectors rather than stuff that kids might actually like to play with. Around this time, I also visited Pachimon Wars, which is a pub in Osaka that is themed around knockoff Star Wars toys. I made a short video about that a while back. If you haven't seen it, you might want to check that out. And I did pick up a custom Hawaiian shirt that they made for their 5th anniversary. Later that very same day, I stopped by Mandarake in Denden Town, which is kind of the electronics district there in Osaka, and I found one thing in particular that was interesting to me. It's these sets of Super Convoy plastic model kits. They're from sort of the late 70s, and they're unlicensed plastic model kits that they just took some existing kits, I guess, that they had for space or robots and put Star Wars heads on them, essentially. But if I were to get all of them, it would be right around $800 or $900, and that was a lot more than I was willing to spend. Of course, you could find the new Bandai Star Wars figures and things like that fairly easily, but, you know, there's not something that you can't get in America, so I didn't really feel the need to get any of them at this point. In the bargain area of another store, I did find a small selection of sort of Power of the Force 2 and Episode 1 figures, and I decided to get a couple of the Jabba-related ones because they were extremely cheap. They're like $2 a piece, and they have Japanese stickers on the back, which is cool. I've kind of been casually collecting those kind of figures for a while. We also went to Tokyo Disneyland, which was a lot of fun, but I was really surprised to see that there was zero Star Wars merchandise in the entire park. They do have a Star Wars-themed ride, of course, called Star Tours, which I visited about 10 years ago when it was new, and at that point they had a lot of Star Wars merchandise that you could buy when you got off of the ride. There was a whole section of a gift shop and everything. I picked up these plushes of Donald Duck and Goofy as the droids back then, but this time, absolutely nothing, and it was a little strange. I also stopped by various Japanese electronic stores like Yodobashi Camera and Bic Camera. They're electronic stores, but they also have extensive luxury bags and watches and toy sections and stuff like that. They did have a interesting Star Wars display here, but it looked like it had seen better days. It had definitely been put up a number of years ago and kind of been neglected. They had shoved it sort of in a corner. The idea, of course, was that you would maybe take a picture with this and post it on social media. Oh, they also had full-sized Lego Darth Vader and R2-D2 figures, which was also very cool, but they were serving more as, I guess, mascots for their Lego section rather than having anything to do with Star Wars itself. Some of the other smaller locations of Yodobashi Camera that I went to had basically nothing in the way of Star Wars toys whatsoever, but this one did have a reasonably good selection in one case here, but, you know, nothing that amazing, I would say. Nothing I personally wanted to buy either. We also went to Akihabara, and back in the 90s when I first started coming here, I would have explained it as being sort of the electronics district of Tokyo, where they have lots of new and used computers and electronic parts like you see here. But this kind of thing is very rapidly disappearing. These little shops are closing one after another as their owners kind of get older and retire or pass away. So it is kind of sad that a lot of the stores that I used to visit are just no longer here. But on the other hand, it is a very popular tourist destination with foreign people in particular, lots of foreign tourists here, uh, people who are fans of anime and things of that nature, looking for their favorite characters and so forth. So I think that's a good thing for Japan in general. But yeah, it is a different experience, even just compared to maybe 10 years ago. In particular, there's been a huge increase in the number of maid-themed cafes and people here trying to recruit customers. So as I mentioned, the focus was really on Japanese pop culture, generally speaking. So they had a lot of arcades with prizes you could win in crane games like these, things like anime figures and stuffed animals of cute Japanese characters. Speaking of crane games, I did manage to win this weird blue hamster in just a couple tries, and this adorable leopard gecko in a lot more than a couple tries. But then I tried to get this Pokemon, who I don't even know the name of, and after wasting entirely too much money, all I got was this plastic ball that was at the bottom of the machine. So I decided I should probably quit while I was ahead, or, behind. There were lots of stores selling new and used anime figures and things of that nature. This was the main focus, it seemed like. And for me, not being a huge anime fan, I did not really find anything that was that interesting to me. I found this sort of bargain bin of old lightsabers at one store, and it kind of symbolized to me the attitude of Akihabara in general. It seemed like there was very little excitement around Star Wars, to be honest with you. But that's not to say that they didn't have a lot of interesting stuff to look at, including vintage Japanese toys in some places. And I've been getting into Japanese sofubi, soft vinyl figures more and more recently, so that was very cool to see. And in fact, I think I'm going to make another video just about that. These capsule toy machines are literally everywhere you go in Japan, it seems. I actually really like these, and I spent way too much money on them. In fact, I think I'll make a video about this as well. But I thought I should also mention that in Akihabara and other large cities, you can often find places that sell this kind of toy individually in case you have trouble completing a set, or you might even be able to buy a complete set all at once. So I will be including some of the things that I found in Akihabara in other videos, but in terms of Star Wars, there was not a huge amount that I actually wanted to get. However, I did find something at Kotobukiya here, and it actually features Jabba, although it's nothing to get too excited about. Kotobukiya, you may recall, is a manufacturer of figures and various other licensed products in Japan. So stick around for the second video in this series if you want to see what I got there. There's another YouTuber called Scruffy Lookin RGB who focuses mostly on retro gaming in Japan, but who's also a fan of Star Wars, and I've known them for quite a while through Instagram, and we decided that it would be a good chance to meet and go somewhere while I was in Tokyo, so we decided we'd go to Starcase, which is a store that focuses only on Star Wars merchandise. It's up here on the second floor of the building, and they don't really seem to be open regular hours anymore these days, but you can try contacting them on Instagram if you're thinking of going. They did have some signs up, by the way, saying you're not supposed to take photos, but we asked the owner and he seemed to be okay with it. As soon as I walked in, I was greeted by this poster with Jabba on it, which was a good sign, I thought. I already have one, and I don't think this one was for sale anyway, but Starcase is a relatively small store, but it is jam-packed with stuff, including statues, other kinds of vintage toys and merchandise, action figures, Lego, just about anything you can think of. It did seem like there was sometimes a mix of things that were for sale and things that were basically just for decoration or, not for sale, including this really impressive case here of vintage Kenner figures. That was pretty cool that he had up by the cash register. So, it's not always easy to tell if something specific is for sale or how much it costs. Prices varied. Some items, like loose vintage figures, were not too bad. And in other cases, it might be hundreds of dollars for just a tiny little figure, or in the case of this candy, it was about $400. So, you know, it varies. But it was certainly a lot of fun to look through his display cases. He's got some vintage jewelry here, Japanese rubber keshi figures. These are vintage bottle caps with scenes from A New Hope on them from the 70s. Just a lot of cool stuff. I was particularly amused by this store display for a pair of Star Wars themed vacuum cleaners. He definitely had the largest selection of vintage Kenner figures that I've seen in Japan, including a fair selection of loose ones, which is nice to see. And as I say, many of them were not really that bad. I mean, at worst, they would be kind of normal eBay prices, but a few of them, given the exchange rate, seemed like actually decent deals. I did end up getting something from this case, but I'll leave it to you to guess what that might be, and I'll reveal it in the next video in this series. We talked to the owner for a while. I asked if he had any Jabba-related items. He didn't really have anything particularly interesting that I didn't already have, but we also talked about soft vinyl figures, Sofubi. I had almost forgotten that Starcase had actually created a number of soft vinyl figures with a Star Wars theme, and most of them were a few years ago, I guess, but I'd really like to try and track some of those down. They didn't have any available for sale in the store, unfortunately. By the way, Scruffy Lookin RGB got me this cool Jabba pillow from Japan. I did already have one that I got a few years ago, but it's really nice to have a spare that I can actually use now. After Starcase, we decided to go to Nakano Broadway because it's actually quite close by, and it's one of the places I definitely wanted to go. I think it might be best explained as a sort of shopping mall with lots of little shops that specialize in mostly vintage toys and, a few other things as well. You really never know what you're going to find. There are shops just filled to the brim with old Japanese toys like this, and some of them will have a mixture of old and new Japanese and American toys, antiques. This place had just a really eclectic mix of things. Got Japanese books and toys, old and new. We've got these Pepsi bottle caps from the early 2000s for all kinds of Star Wars characters. Of course, they have plenty of anime figures like these as well. You can't get away from these in Japan, it seems like. But in addition to that, there's just a huge selection of vintage toys of all descriptions. One of my favorite stores is this Mandarake Henya, which sort of specializes in high-end, older Japanese, vintage toys and also Western toys as well. Very expensive stuff here, frankly, and a lot of it, someone who's not a collector of this kind of toy, I can't really appreciate how rare they are and why they're worth what they're asking for them. But, they can be hundreds or thousands of dollars in some cases for just a tiny little figure. But beyond what they were actually displaying, I thought the way they displayed them with these really cool kind of floating crystal shelves was really awesome. And just really liked browsing around here. So whether you're into Gundam and Transformer type robot toys, Japanese rubber keshi toys like these, pro wrestling figures, or even pro wrestling masks like these, and even things like model trains and model cars, basically, I think Nakano Broadway has you covered regardless of where your interests lie, even if you like really creepy antique dolls. So as you might expect with this kind of selection, I did have some luck finding Star Wars things here. I did find a vintage Jabba playset here at Mandarake, which is a chain store that has a lot of locations here in Nakano Broadway. They were asking about $300 for it. I didn't really need it, but it was very nice to see. They also had a fairly good selection of other vintage Kenner items, as you can see here. They even had some larger statues on display and for sale as well. These are some very impressive vintage pieces here, way out of my price range, of course, but it was very interesting to see some of these things in person that I've never seen outside of pictures, like these Popey Japanese figures there in the center. Those were very cool to see, although they're going for about $600 a piece. I also had a boxed Rancor monster and a carded Rancor Keeper there. It's kind of cool. But this is pretty much all of the vintage stuff aside from a few things here and there that I was able to find, so I wouldn't say it's all that common, actually. It did, of course, have some newer items on display as well. A nearby store called Robot had a lot of sort of newer Star Wars toys, as well as other kinds of American toys. I had a lot of fun just browsing around here. You know, these stores are physically not very large, but they're jam-packed with stuff, I'll have to say that. They had quite a selection of a little bit newer carded Star Wars toys, so Power of the Force 2 and onward, I would say. You know, it's actually pretty cool to look at all these. They're a little on the expensive side, to be honest, even with the favorable exchange rate relative to the dollar, but you know, if you're looking for a certain figure, being able to pick it up in person is pretty cool. And they also had some Disney exclusives and other things of that nature. So yeah, it was very cool to see all this stuff on display. I didn't end up getting anything from here, but I did really like the way they had sort of a mix of vintage and newer items on display. I found several Jabba items that I didn't need, but I was happy to see. There's the Jabba Pepsi cap, and of course the Size Noodles candy container from the 80s. Some Pez dispensers there, and some Star Cars. We've got a little Jabba statue there that I also have, and you know, just an interesting mix of stuff here. You can really look here for quite some time. They had the Galactic Buddies Jabba and Salacious Crumb, as well as some other plushes and a Jabba Glob. And below that was a boxed Rancor, you may have noticed. Here's the shampoo or bubble bath from the 80s. And, you know, just lots of random stuff. There's an Amanaman there in the back, vintage figure. I found this Jabba the Hutt and two-headed announcer figure, which is actually the Japanese version with a Japanese language sticker on the back. I already had it in better condition, or I might have gotten it. I do enjoy knockoff toys, and I was kind of tempted by these Galaxy Empire ones, but I didn't end up getting them. They were in a little bit rough shape, kind of popping through the bubble. And I really liked the way that they were using this vintage bedsheet material just to cover up one of their counters. Those stores definitely had the largest concentration of Star Wars stuff, but you could find it here and there in the midst of other things, like you've got a Rancor just kind of hiding out here, as well as a few other Star Wars things. Kind of funny. I spotted a Kubrick version of the Max Rebo Band here at another Mandarake store, and it was actually a pretty decent deal, although it was missing the box and the display cardboard that it comes with. I already have this, of course, too, so I had to kind of resist not buying another one. It was not a bad price. Now that I think about it, I got the one that I have at Nakano Broadway about 15 years ago. So as you can see, I did have a fair amount of success in finding Star Wars stuff in Japan, but I did have to work pretty hard at it, and that really wasn't the case previous times when I have been in Japan. It just sort of was there all around me. And my feeling is that, for better or worse, it's become a little bit more of a niche thing. I think not having any major movies in the theaters is affecting it as well. It's keeping it out of the public consciousness to some degree, but it's weird because a character like Grogu, who you can't get away from in America with all these cute versions of him, is basically nowhere to be found in Japan, and I don't really understand why. You'd think that would be a great opportunity to market Star Wars, but to be clear, there are still a lot of Star Wars fans in Japan, but they seem to be trending older. I kind of wonder about the next generation of fans, what's going to happen with that, although to some degree I worry about that in the US as well. Anyway, if you'd like to see what I got in Japan, related to Star Wars anyway, I'm going to be making that into a second video that I'll be posting relatively shortly. I was originally going to put the items I got at the Toji Temple flea market at the end of this video, but I think it ended up being a little bit too long to do that. So I'm going to put them on an unlisted video that you can just click right here to view if you're interested. Thanks very much for watching. This video, like all my videos, was brought to you with the help of my Palace VIPs on Patreon, including Angelica Brady, Jesper Murtu, and all of my other patrons as well. If you'd like to know how you can support the channel for as little as $1 a month, you can check out the link in the video description.